Yeah, I think that all these things that NASA do are actually connected to something greater, or most of it anyway. And someone who did a documentary on the moon and the nature of artifacts on the moon talked to a NASA insider who said we lied about everything. And I think we have to keep that in mind when they are producing these probes and these missions. What they actually tell us they're about and what they tell us they've found is not going to be the truth unless the truth will not affect our perception of reality. I've written extensively about the moon. I don't believe, and even more so as I understand more, I don't believe that the moon is a natural body, or at least at the very least it's a construct from a body that maybe is natural but has been, if you like, converted. And you know, one of the things we talked about during the show was this idea of suppression of people's perception of the possible. And we are going to have to wide open our minds, crash open our minds so wide, if we're going to start to understand the nature of the human plight. For instance, the idea that something that is 2,160 miles in diameter, the moon, could be a construct is beyond the comprehension, the sense of possibility of most people, because it's just, we can't build that. Yeah, no, we can't build that, but that does not mean that it cannot be built if you understand the nature of reality. And you know, one of the things that I've been focusing on in the last few years, and I'm a big time at this moment, is the nature of Saturn and what Saturn is. It's very clear that at one point Saturn did not have rings, but was actually, I say Saturn is a dwarf sun, a dwarf star. I said Jupiter's the same. The Saturn gives off 2.5 times more energy than it receives from the sun. It is a form of star, not a planet as we perceive it. And the rings are artificial, I suggest. There's a man called Norman Bergrun who has a long history in aeronautics and space research and science and that whole arena. He's in his 90s now, but he wrote a book some years ago, back in the 80s I think it was, called The Ring Makers of Saturn, because he observed from the pictures sent back by the Voyager missions, Voyager 1 and 2 to Saturn, also to Jupiter, but to Saturn then, that there were gigantic electromagnetic phenomena in the rings of Saturn that were actually creating them. This all fits with what I say Saturn is, which is a gigantic broadcasting system, which is broadcasting this fake reality in league with the moon, which is like something that picks that up and amplifies it at the Earth, so we get it big time strong. And this is the way that at least part of this matrix is formed.
Haven't you written in the past, though, that, and let me go back to Mars for a second, David, and all this stuff is in your books, and it's very intriguing, very interesting about the moon, and certainly Saturn, and again, it's like the reptilian thing. We see the demagoguery of it. We see it used everywhere, and they worship it, so we should be suspicious. Talk about suspicious minds. You had written in a few of your books talking about Mars having been the original colony, that Mars was destroyed or burned out, and then the people had moved here, and then in fact a lot of the Aryan race, Aryan worship comes from something like Mars. Are you still in that mind?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, you know, I was going to go on, but you've taken me there, which is great, about Mars, because there's an excellent book written quite a long time ago now by a man called David Tolbert, who seems to be an excellent researcher, and he's involved in this whole area of the electric universe, which is fundamentally important to understanding how the universe works. And he wrote a book years ago called The Saturn Myth. And the Saturn Myth was the result of what seems like decades of research into ancient legends, accounts, symbols relating to Saturn. And it's fascinating. I mean, you mentioned a book about, you know, things being all around us, so we should look at them. Well, Saturn is all around us in the most extraordinary way in terms of symbols. There's Saturn symbolism everywhere. Courts are Saturn symbols. The black gowns of judges and when you get your degree in education, that is Saturn. The cube is Saturn. This is why they have the black cube in Mecca, which is the focus of worship of the Islamic religion. It's everywhere, and I go into it in the book, so I'm really going to go into this at Wembley in big time as well, and I'm going further on all the time as I understand more. And it's one of the big pennies that dropped with me that brought this kaleidoscope into much greater focus, Jack, was when I realized that actually Saturn was once the prime sun of the Earth. It was in a very different position to the one where it is now, and it didn't have rings. And there was this phenomenal cataclysm, which people like Emanuel Velikovsky wrote about in the 50s, to great ridicule, of course, but people like David Tolbert and the Electric Universe fraternity now that have got this whole area of science, which is very, very credible. They are supporting this whole basic theme, not every detail, but the theme of Velikovsky's work, which was that there was this fantastic cataclysm which links to the Great Flood and all the ancient accounts of the earth tipping over and mountains soaring out of the earth and all this stuff in the ancient past, and the way that the solar system was rearranged. And Tolbert's reading of this from the ancient accounts is that there was a catastrophic interaction during this cataclysmic event between the Earth and Mars, and enormous electromagnetic bolts were exchanged between the two. And Mars, which was nothing like, well, I say it is now, is nothing like we're told it is now, before this cataclysmic event or events, it seems to be more than one, which for me, Mars was not the desolate planet that we're told it is now. That long ago. People talk about, science talks about, well, millions and millions of years ago, you know, this happened. No, much, much, much closer than that. Because, you know, you can bash something over a period of time, or you can set it on fire and destroy it in a minute. And something massively cataclysmic hit or affected Mars, which changed its nature very, very quickly. And the solar system we see today is nothing like the solar system that the ancients describe. And Mars is, what do they call it? What do they call Mars? They call the planet of war. And one expression of this is that there was this symbolic war in the heavens that the ancients talked about. And Saturn ceased to be the sun, because it was a two-sun system then. We had the sun that we know now, and we had the sun that we call Saturn, that was much closer to the Earth than our sun, and thus was the prime sun from Earth's perspective. And then it went walkabout. Venus went walkabout. So did Mars. So did Jupiter in this great cataclysmic event. And interestingly, the observations of Norman Bergrun, looking at the images that came back from the Voyager missions to Saturn, and which have been supported by the later Cassini mission to Saturn in its images, is that there are these enormous electromagnetic phenomena, he calls them vehicles, which are spewing out, he calls it exhaust, I say it's something very different, that are actually creating the rings. And you know, the official story is that the rings of Saturn are full of ice, basically, ice particles of various sizes. I say that is actually some form of crystal, maybe that we don't know about on Earth and have never come across. But those rings are a receiver transmission system
It looks like a giant antenna. Hello?
Yes, exactly. And you know, one of the things that the Cassini mission found is that there are enormously powerful radio emissions, hello, coming from Saturn. And there is at one pole of Saturn a continuous hexagram storm twirling. At the other pole there is a storm that looks just like an eye, a continuous storm. And they found that this hexagon storm, I say hexagon, but hexagon storm, is moving in relation to the radio signal emissions. And you can go on the internet and put in sounds from Saturn in a search engine, and you can hear some of these really horrible sounds that are being recorded coming out of Saturn. And what I'm saying here is that sound represents the information matrix that the human genetic manipulation recorded by all these ancient cultures has been tuned in to pick up and decode into reality. And what reality we would be, how our reality would be different if we weren't decoding that, what I call the hack, into our reality, into our sense of reality. I don't know, but I think it is substantial. And that if that was not broadcasting and we weren't receiving and transmitting in it through manipulated DNA, then I think the world that we would be experiencing through the conscious mind would be very different to the one we are now. You know, exactly in line with the Matrix movies.
Let's really freak people out, because one of the top experts in planetary life was asked about why go to Mars. And he said, I wouldn't even waste my time going to Mars. He said, I would go to Euclideus, Saturn's moon, or Titan. He mentioned Euclideus, and he said that is the closest possibility of Earth atmosphere holding life. It's like a little Earth, allegedly. So here we have not only Titan, but possibly Euclideus, that could have life.
Yes, I think very different life to us, because, you know, what I'm going into now is that, you know, behind this reptilian element and behind possibly all this so-called extraterrestrial interaction, I prefer to call them interdimensionals, is a force which doesn't take form. It is like an electromagnetic form which can take any form, and it works through these other groups. And what I found fascinating was to read in some detail in the last few months the content of a find in Egypt in 1945 of a sealed jar of writings from a group that had become known as the Gnostics. The Gnostics were the people behind the great library of Alexandria, which was sacked and burned and destroyed by the Roman Church. They were basically the mentality behind the Cathars in southern France that were destroyed by the authorities and the Roman Church. Their last stand was a castle called Montségur in, I think it was 1244, something like that. And what you see as a common theme is these Gnostic thinkers, these that have this Gnostic view of the reality in the universe, end up being slaughtered, and their information, if not being destroyed, then being taken out of public circulation. I think you'll find a lot of it in the vaults of the Vatican, personally. And it's interesting what these Gnostic writings talk about. About a fifth of the writings in this sealed container discovered in Egypt, which seems to go back to around 400 AD, which was in the period when the great library of Alexandria in Egypt was destroyed. About a fifth